What does it cost a woman to buy back a single word? Simone Radcliffe had never met a problem she couldn't price. She ran Halcyon Capital Partners from the 41st floor of a glass tower over the Chicago River, and by the time most of the city was pouring its first coffee, she had already moved more money than some countries hold in reserve. Rivals called her the closer, and not warmly. She had a way of going quiet in a negotiation until the silence itself became a weapon. But there was one silence Simone could not win, one she had been losing for 1,131 days, and it lived in the small body of her 6-year-old son. Somewhere across town, a man with river dust in the creases of his hands was about to kneel in front of that boy and undo 3 years of medicine, money, and prayer with a handful of words he didn't even remember saying, and the reason he could do it would break your heart wide open. The silence had a birthday. Simone knew it the way she knew her own pulse. It began on a Friday in August 3 years earlier, during the kind of storm the local news gives a name to. She had been on the phone with London, hammering out the last clause of a fund that would make her firm the biggest private lender in the Midwest, and she had told Julian to go on without her. "Take Wyatt to the cabin. I'll drive up when I close." Her husband had laughed at her, not unkindly, and said the thing he always said, that she would negotiate with the weatherman if she thought she could get a better forecast. Then he had loaded their son into the back of the Volvo and driven north into a sky the color of a bruise. She would replay the timing of it for the rest of her life. 6 minutes. If the London call had ended 6 minutes sooner, she'd have been in that car. Instead, she was standing at a floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of wine, watching the lightning walk across the lake, when the call came from a hospital in a town she'd never heard of. The storm had dropped 4 inches of rain in 90 minutes. A viaduct on the old state road had filled like a bathtub, and Julian, who had driven that road 100 times, had misjudged the water in the dark. The Volvo went in nose first and floated for a moment, and then didn't. Julian, pinned by a buckled dashboard, drowned in the front seat. Wyatt, 3 years old and strapped into a booster in the back, was trapped in a shrinking pocket of air in the rising black water for 19 minutes before a water rescue diver got a window open and pulled him out. 19 minutes. The doctors kept using the word miracle, not a scratch on him. His lungs were clear, his heart was strong, his little body had come through without a mark. But something behind his eyes had gone down into that dark water and had not come back up. Wyatt did not cry at the funeral. He did not cry at all. In the weeks after, the crying stopped, and then the laughing, and then, one gray morning in October, the talking. He was 3.5, and he simply closed his mouth, and for 1,131 days, he had kept it closed. Simone had done what Simone did. She threw resources at it the way she threw resources at a failing acquisition. She flew in a pediatric trauma psychiatrist from Boston, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins, a specialist in childhood mutism from a clinic in Zurich who charged by the hour in a currency Simone had to look up. She converted a wing of her house in Lincoln Park into a therapy suite with soft lighting and a saltwater fish tank, and every sensory-friendly toy money could ship overnight. The bills, when she let herself look at them, ran into the high 6 figures, and she paid them without blinking, because what was money for, if not this? Dr. Naomi Frost, the gentlest of all the experts and the only one Wyatt tolerated, had finally told her the truth in plain language during their 90th session. His voice works, Simone. His brain doesn't want to use it. Somewhere down in the oldest part of him, he decided that sound is dangerous. His own sound most of all. He went silent to stay safe. He won't speak again until some part of him believes, all the way down, that the water is really gone. She had paused then and put her hand over Simone's and said the thing that had haunted her ever since. You can't purchase that belief. It isn't for sale. Someone has to give it to him. Simone Radcliffe, who could buy almost anything, sat with that sentence like a stone in her chest. Every morning she knelt at the edge of Wyatt's bed and said good morning to a boy who answered with his hands. He had Julian's serious mouth and her own dark, watchful eyes, and he moved through his enormous quiet house like a small ghost, communicating in the clumsy sign language a tutor had taught him and in a tablet he wore strapped to his wrist. Good morning, Mama, his fingers would say. And she would button his collar and smile and feel her heart come apart along the same seam it came apart along every single day. 12 miles south and a whole world away, in a narrow brick two-flat in the Bridgeport neighborhood, a man named Elias Thorne was standing at his kitchen sink at 5:40 in the morning, scrubbing mortar out from under his nails with a vegetable brush and losing. Elias was 36, though the gray coming in at his temples and the permanent squint around his eyes made strangers guess older. He was a stonemason now. He restored the old limestone and brick of the city's forgotten buildings, cornices and lintels, and the carved faces over doorways that nobody looked up at anymore. He was good with his hands in a way that had become rare, patient with stone, the way you have to be patient with a thing that will still be standing long after you are gone. But there had been another life before this one, a life he wore like a coat he couldn't take off. For 11 years, Elias had been a rescue diver with the city's water rescue unit. He had pulled the living and the dead out of the lake and the river and the flooded low places where the city drained when the sky opened. He had been decorated twice. He had loved it with a completeness that scared his wife. And then one summer night 3 years back, he had gone down into a flooded viaduct after a sinking car, and something in him had broken so quietly that he didn't notice at first, the way a rib can crack and not hurt until you breathe. After that night, the nightmares came, and then the daytime versions of them, the ones that arrived in grocery stores and at red lights with no warning at all. He'd hear a fire truck and his hands would go numb. He turned in his gear before they could ask him to. 6 months later, his wife, Marisol, who had been fighting a cancer that never gave her a fair fight, lost the last round of it, and Elias was left alone with a mountain of medical debt and an 8-year-old daughter named Winnie. Winnie was the reason he got up before the sun. She had been born profoundly hard of hearing, and the world of sound reached her only through a pair of hearing aids that cost more than Elias's truck and had to be replaced as she grew, and through the speech therapy that the insurance covered right up until the moment it decided it didn't. She was a bright, fierce, funny kid who read lips like a card sharp and signed a mile a minute and wanted, more than anything, to be a marine biologist, which broke Elias's heart in a different way every time she said it, because it meant she was not afraid of the water that had taken so much from them. Dad. Winnie was in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, signing and speaking at once the way she did at home. You said you'd braid it tight today. Not the loose way. He dried his hands and knelt to do her hair, and his big cracked fingers did the small, precise work of it. And he thought, as he thought every morning, that this was the only job he had ever done that mattered. That was the reason he was up early and scrubbing his nails raw, because today was the biggest contract of his year, and he could not afford to look like what he was. His crew had been hired, 3 subcontracts down from a firm he'd never spoken to finish the exterior stone restoration on the old Aurelia Concert Hall downtown, a beautiful wreck of a building that some foundation had spent a fortune bringing back from the dead. Tonight, the foundation was throwing a dedication gala to show it off. The mayor, the donors, the whole gleaming circus of it. Elias's job was to have the last of the carved medallions cleaned and set on the grand staircase before the doors opened, and to stay out of the photographs. He dropped Winnie at his sister's, drove his battered pickup into the loop, and spent the day 30 feet up on a scaffold, coaxing 100 years of grime off the face of a stone angel, while below him, the great hall filled up with the noise of people who had never in their lives worried about a hearing aid or a booster seat. By 6 o'clock, the Aurelia was a roar. Florists were wheeling in cut peonies by the cartload. A string quartet was tuning against a sound check that kept blasting over them. Waiters in white jackets carried towers of champagne through a crowd that got louder with every glass. And into the middle of all of it, an hour early, walked Simone Radcliffe, because Halcyon Capital was the lead donor, and she was expected to say a few words, and because she had, against the advice of everyone she paid to advise her, brought her son. She had brought him because Dr. Frost had said, carefully, that gentle new environments might help, and because she could not bear one more evening of leaving him behind with a nanny and a fish tank. She'd brought his noise-canceling headphones and a quiet room stocked with his things, and a nanny named Grace, whose whole job tonight was Wyatt. She had thought of everything. She always thought of everything. She was 15 minutes into a conversation with the mayor's chief of staff when Grace appeared at her elbow, gray-faced, and Simone knew before the woman spoke. "I turned around to get his water," Grace said. 10 seconds. He was right there, and then he wasn't. The floor tilted. For one long blank moment, Simone was 3 years old herself, standing at a window over the lake with a glass of wine, learning that the worst thing had already happened while she was looking the other way. Then the closer came back into her body like a current. "Lock the doors," she said. Her voice did not rise, which was somehow worse. "Nobody leaves this building. He's 6. He is here in this building, and he cannot call out for help, so we are going to find him." She was already moving, kicking off her heels and carrying them, cutting through the beautiful crowd with her eyes going everywhere at once. She checked the coat room, the ladies' lounge, the catering hall, where the noise was a physical thing. She found herself at the foot of the grand staircase, the newly cleaned stone pale and glowing under the chandeliers, and she saw a door tucked behind the sweep of it, a service door left ajar, opening onto a dim back stairwell where the restoration wasn't finished yet. She went through it into sudden quiet, and she stopped. 20 feet up the half-lit stairs, a big man in a canvas work jacket and dusty boots was kneeling on the bare concrete, and sitting on the step in front of him, small and rigid, his hands clamped over his ears and his whole body shaking, was Wyatt. Every animal instinct in Simone screamed. A strange man, her mute child, a dark stairwell, her mouth open to bring the whole building down, and then she saw her son's face and the scream died in her throat. Wyatt was not crying. He was not hiding. He was staring up at the stranger with an expression she had not seen on his face in 3 years. A fixed, trembling, hungry attention, like a boy watching for something he had given up hope of ever seeing again. Elias had not gone looking for a lost child. He had ducked into the back stairwell for the same reason he always ducked into the quiet places, because his own head got loud in crowds, and the champagne roar out there had been pressing on an old bruise. He'd found the boy on the 3rd landing, folded into the corner, hyperventilating, in the grip of a full panic attack. The kid was in a little navy blazer that probably cost more than Elias made in a week, and there was an expensive tablet on his wrist flashing a dead battery, and none of that mattered, because Elias had spent 11 years learning to read a body in distress, and this body was drowning on dry land. He did what the old training told him to do. He made himself small and slow. He didn't ask the boy where his parents were, because questions need a working mind, and this boy didn't have one to spare right now. He set his phone on the step with the flashlight pointed at the wall, so there was a little pool of soft light instead of glare. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, past the tape measure and the chalk line, and found the thing he always carried there. A small, smooth river stone, gray-blue and worn to satin, that Marisol had pressed into his hand at the hospital in her last week and called his worry stone. "Hey, sailor," Elias said, low and rough, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. He wasn't even thinking about the words. They came up out of some deep place on their own. "That's a lot of noise out there, huh? But it can't get you back here. Back here it's just you and me." The boy's breath hitched. "I got something for your hands," Elias said. He held the stone out flat on his palm, not reaching, just offering. "It's a river stone, smoothest thing you ever felt. My little girl says it's got the whole river's quiet stored up inside it. You want to hold the quiet for a minute?" Slowly, one small hand came away from one ear. The boy looked at the stone. He looked at the big scarred hand under it, and he reached out and took the stone and closed his fingers around it and brought it to his chest. Something moved across Elias's face, a flicker, a shadow. He knew this. Not this boy. He was sure he'd never seen this boy, but this exact shape of a frightened child taking a stone from his hand. He pushed it down. Not now. He leaned in a little, and his voice dropped into a rhythm older than his own memory of it, a cadence he'd used in the back of an ambulance and a sinking car and 100 bad nights. And he said the thing he used to say, the little chant he'd made up years ago for a scared kid in the dark. "You're the captain now." Hold the stone, count me to the shore, and I'll get you home. And Wyatt Radcliffe, who had not made a sound since he was 3.5 years old, opened his mouth. At first there was nothing, just his lips moving and his throat working, and a look of terrible effort crossing his small face, the effort of a boy trying to lift something that had been sitting on him for 3 years. His eyes filled, his hands shook around the stone. And then, in a voice like a rusty hinge, a voice that hadn't been used in so long it barely remembered how, he whispered 4 words that made no sense to anyone in the world but two. Did we get to the shore? The stairwell went so quiet that Simone could hear the blood in her own ears. She made a sound then that she didn't recognize as coming from her, a broken, disbelieving intake of breath, and her knees simply stopped holding her. She sat down hard on the concrete steps, her $1,000 dress fanning out in the dust, her hands pressed over her mouth. He spoke. Her mind refused it and grabbed it at the same time. He spoke. My son spoke. And Elias Thorne, kneeling on the step with his hands still open where the stone had been, went white to the lips. Because the moment the boy's rusty little voice said the word shore, 3 years came off Elias's memory like a sheet pulled off furniture, rain hammering on black water, headlights going green and then dark under the surface, a window that wouldn't give. Reaching through the gap into a car that was more than half full of the flood, and finding, wedged into a booster seat in a shrinking pocket of air, a little boy of 3 with his father dead and silent in the seat in front of him. Elias had gotten the boy's face against his own shoulder so the child couldn't see. He'd told him to hold on to him like the captain of a ship. He'd given the terrified boy a stone from his own pocket to squeeze, and he'd said the chant over and over into his small ear. You're the captain now. Hold the stone, count me to the shore, for the long, roaring minutes it took to work him free and haul him up into the strobing red night. He had handed that boy off to a paramedic on the embankment, and he had never learned his name. That was the night that broke him. That was the last dive he ever made. Oh, God, Elias breathed, and his voice cracked straight down the middle. He looked at the boy, and at the stone in the boy's fist, and at the shattered woman on the stairs, and the pieces slammed together with a force that took the air out of him. It's you. You're the boy from the bridge. Simone's head came up. Her mind, that fine machine that priced everything, was racing to connect a set of dots that could not possibly connect. Why him? Why would her son, silent before the best doctors on 3 continents, speak to a stranger in work boots on a back stairwell? Who are you? She got out, her whole body shaking. Who are you? But Elias was already standing, backing up the stairs, his hands out in front of him like a man warding off a fire. The past had come up the stairwell and grabbed him by the throat, and he could not stay in the same air as it. I have to go, he said. I'm sorry. I have to go. And before she could get to her feet, before she could form a single one of the 1,000 questions detonating in her skull, he turned and went up the stairs 2 at a time, and out a fire door into the loud bright night, leaving the closer sitting in the dust of a half-finished stairwell with a son who had at last found his voice. Wyatt didn't cry after that. The 3 words had cost him everything he had. He slumped sideways into his mother's arms and was asleep before she finished gathering him up, the river stone still locked in his fist. And Simone held him against her chest and rocked him, and did not care that the mayor was looking for her, or that 400 people were waiting, or that her security chief had just come crashing through the service door with his hand on his radio. Miss Radcliffe. Hollis' car started, and then he saw her face and stopped. He spoke, Hollis, she said, and she started to laugh and cry at the same time in a way that alarmed him more than screaming would have. He asked a question. He wanted to know if we got to the shore. She pressed her lips to her son's hair, and then, when she lifted her head, the closer was back behind her wet eyes, colder and more focused than Carr had ever seen her. There was a man, big, work jacket, boots, gray coming in at the temples. He's on the stone crew. He went out the north fire door 90 seconds ago. She stood, lifting her sleeping son as if he weighed nothing. Cancel my remarks. Have the car brought to the loading dock. And Hollis, I want that man's name, his address, and every day of his life on paper by the time I get Wyatt home and into bed. Do you understand me? Do not fail me on this one thing. Elias got home to Bridgeport a little before 9, having driven the whole way with his hands shaking on the wheel. He picked Winnie up from his sister's, and she signed at him the whole ride back, telling him about a documentary she'd watched about octopuses, and he nodded and made the right faces and did not hear a word of it, because a small rusty voice was going around and around in his skull. Did we get to the shore? 3 years he had told himself the boy from the bridge was fine, was grown a little now, was somewhere out there living a life that had nothing to do with the man who'd found him. He had needed that to be true. And now he knew that the boy had carried Elias's own voice down into a silence 3 years deep, had held it there like the stone in his fist, waiting. He got Winnie fed and bathed and into bed. He stood at his own kitchen sink again, in the dark this time, and let himself come apart quietly, the way he'd learned to, so his daughter wouldn't hear a thing. At 9:40, someone knocked on his door. He knew who it was before he looked. You could not outrun money like that, and you certainly could not outrun a mother. He opened the door, and Simone Radcliffe stood in the dim hallway of his walk-up in a coat that cost more than his month's rent. Her eyes swollen, her hands trembling, the closer nowhere in sight. Behind her, at a respectful distance, stood the big man from the loading dock. "Mr. Thorne," she said quietly. "Miss Radcliffe." He leaned against the doorframe, bone-tired. "I'm sorry I ran off the job. You don't have to pay me for today." I don't care about the stone." She glanced past him, at the small tidy apartment, at the stack of medical bills on the entry table he hadn't had time to hide, at a little pair of hearing aids charging on the counter. "My head of security ran the crew list. It took him 40 minutes to find out that before you laid stone for a living, you spent 11 years pulling people out of the water for the city. You were on the Swiftwater team, Station 9. Elias's throat closed. He said nothing. Station 9 was the unit that answered the viaduct on the state road 3 years ago in August, Simone said, and her voice broke on the word August. A gray Volvo. A man and a little boy. "Please," Elias said, and his eyes went past her to the hallway where his daughter slept. "Not out here. Not where my girl might hear." Simone understood at once. She turned to Hollis. "Wait in the car. Miss Radcliffe protocol. Wait in the car, Hollis." The steel came back for one instant and then left her again as she turned to Elias. "May I come in, please? I have spent 3 years and more money than I ever want to count, trying to understand my son's silence. And tonight, in a dirty stairwell, he broke it for a stranger with a rock. I need to know why. I think you know why." He stepped back and opened the door. Inside, she looked absurdly out of place among the thrift store furniture and the crayon drawings taped to the fridge. A woman made of glass and steel sat down in a room made of paper and love. She didn't sit. She turned to face him, and her dark eyes, she realized only now how much they looked like Wyatt's, found his. "You were there," she said. "You were in the car with them." Elias walked to the sink and gripped its edge and looked out the black window, putting the length of the kitchen between himself and what he was about to say. When it came, his voice was flat, scraped clean of feeling, because feeling was the thing he couldn't afford. "I was the first one in the water. Your husband was in the driver's seat. The car had gone in nose down and the front was already full. I couldn't get his door. I couldn't get anything to move." He paused. "He was gone by the time I reached him. I'm sorry. I've been sorry for 3 years." Simone made a small sound and pressed her fist to her mouth. She had read the report. Hearing it from the mouth of the man who'd been in the water was a different country of pain. "But the boy in the back was alive," Elias went on, forcing the words out because this woman was owed them, even if each one took a layer of skin. There was a pocket of air up in the corner where the booster was, and he'd kept his chin in it. He was awake. And he was screaming, except no sound was coming out, just his mouth open, screaming, and his eyes on his dad in the front seat. Elias turned around, and now there were tears standing in his eyes, and he let them. I couldn't let him keep looking at that. So I got the back window open, and I reached in, and I pulled his face against my shoulder, and I covered his eyes with my hand. And the water was still coming up, and it was going to take us both a while to get free, so I had to keep him from going into shock. I had to give him something to hold on to. "The stone," Simone whispered. "I always carried one." He wiped his face with the back of his wrist. I gave it to him and I told him he was the captain of the ship, and I made up a little count to give him something to do with the fear. And I said it into his ear, over and over, my hand over his eyes, until they cut us loose. You're the captain now. Hold the stone, count me to the shore, and I'll get you home. He shook his head slowly, wonder and grief tangled together. It was almost 20 minutes. He never heard the metal. He never saw his father again. I made sure of that. And then I handed him up to a medic on the bank, and I never knew his name. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the refrigerator and the rain that had started against the window. And in that silence, Simone Radcliffe finally understood the thing that had defeated Zurich and Boston and Johns Hopkins. Wyatt had not gone silent because sound was dangerous. Wyatt had gone silent because in the single worst moment of his small life, one human voice had wrapped itself around him in the dark and told him he was safe. And then that voice had vanished and never come back, and the world had never once given him a sign that the shore existed, that the water was really gone, that it was safe to come up. He had been holding his breath for 3 years. He had been waiting, in the dark, for the captain to finish the count. He didn't speak tonight because he was healed, Simone said slowly, the truth assembling itself in her mouth. He spoke because you came back. He was asking you to finish it. He wanted to know if we finally reached the shore. Elias put his face in his hands, and his big shoulders shook, and 3 years of a guilt so heavy he had built a whole quiet life to keep from looking at it began at last to crack. Simone crossed the little kitchen. She was not a woman who touched people. She wrapped her arms around the stranger who had saved her son and held on while he came apart, and she said into his shoulder, fierce and certain, "You didn't fail us. You went down into the worst thing in the world, and you held my baby's soul together with your bare hands. You are the reason he's alive. You are the reason he can speak. You gave him the only safe place he had, and he's been waiting all this time for you to come and tell him the storm is over." The weeks that followed rewrote both their lives, though not in the way you might expect, because Simone Radcliffe was too smart to insult a proud man with a check. She had watched the way Elias's jaw set when he saw her look at his stack of bills, and she understood that a blank check for saving Wyatt would have been the cheapest and cruelest thing she could offer. So she offered something harder and better. She offered to braid their lives together. It started with a Saturday. She invited Elias and Winnie to the house in Lincoln Park, and while Elias stood awkwardly in a marble foyer that made him feel like he'd tracked in mud, his daughter and her son found each other in the backyard and did not need to be introduced. Winnie, who read lips and signed, and Wyatt, who was just remembering how to speak, turned out to have their own perfect language, half signs and half the new rusty words Wyatt was hauling up one at a time, and they were gone into it within minutes, chasing each other across the lawn. Wyatt still had the stone. He would not be parted from it. When he saw Elias come up the steps, he walked right up to the big man, not shrinking, and held it up like a password. Elias got down on one knee. "You kept it," he said. "That's a good stone. Best one I ever had." Wyatt looked at him for a long moment, his throat working the way it did, and then, in his hoarse new voice, he said, "Captain." Simone had to turn away so the boy wouldn't see her cry. From there a rhythm built itself, unlikely and true. Simone did not throw money at Winnie's hearing the way she'd thrown it at Wyatt's silence. She did something more useful with her power than spend it. She got Winnie in front of the best pediatric audiology team in the country, the kind of specialists whose wait lists ran 2 years, and she did it in a week, and she did it quietly, framed as a favor between friends rather than charity, so that Elias's pride could survive it. Within a month, Winnie had hearing aids that actually fit her growing ears and a speech therapist who came to the house, and she was signing to Simone across the dinner table that she intended, one day, to study the octopuses of the deep Pacific, and would Simone please fund the boat. And Elias gave the Radcliffes the thing that Simone, with all her money, had never been able to buy. He gave them ground under their feet. He built Wyatt a small stone and timber cottage at the back of the Lincoln Park garden, a real one, low and thick-walled and quiet, with a window seat and shelves and a door the boy could shut against the noise of the world. A fortress. He'd sit in it with Wyatt for hours, not pushing him to talk, just being there, sanding a piece of oak while the boy watched, until quiet stopped meaning danger and started meaning safe. And slowly, the way a river comes back after a drought, the words returned. First single ones, stone, bird, boat, then two together. Then, one bright afternoon in the new cottage, a whole sentence, fired at Winnie in outrage over a stolen crayon. And Simone stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth and laughed until she wept. She learned some things in those weeks that no boardroom had ever taught her. She learned that the most valuable thing she owned was not the 41st floor or the fund or the name that made rivals go quiet. It was the hour she now spent every evening on the floor of a stone cottage, doing absolutely nothing but being near her son, Dr. Frost had told her, gently, near the end, that there was no substitute for it, that all the specialists in the world were just there to open a door. But the only thing that walked a child the rest of the way home was time and presence and someone deciding, over and over, to simply be there. It turned out the one thing money could not buy was also the one thing it could not replace. On a cold night in November, with the first real snow ticking against the tall windows of Simone's study and a fire going in the hearth, she slid a folder across the desk to Elias, who was drinking a beer and looking, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who slept at night. "I told you I wasn't going to write you a check," she said. "You did." He eyed the folder. "This looks like a check with extra steps." "It's better than a check." She nodded at it. "Open it." He did. It was a proposal, thick and serious, from the newly formed Halcyon Foundation. Across the top of the first page it read, "The Shore Project." "I'm using the firm's money to build safe rooms," Simone said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes were shining. "Storm-hardened, sound-quiet shelters in schools and clinics and community centers in every flood-prone neighborhood in this city. Places a frightened kid can go when the world gets too loud or the water gets too high. Real ones, built to last 100 years. She leaned forward. "I don't want a construction company that'll pour concrete and leave, Elias. I want a man who knows exactly what a terrified child needs in the dark and who knows how to build a wall that will still be standing for that child's grandchildren. I want the man who counted my son to the shore. Thorn Masonry is the builder, and you run the whole thing. Say yes." Elias looked at the folder for a long time. He thought about the black water and the window that wouldn't give, and the 3 years he'd spent hiding from all of it in the honest silence of stone. And then, through the study door, he heard the two of them, his daughter and her son, arguing cheerfully in the next room about the rules of a game they were inventing as they went. Two voices, where 3 years ago there had been a drowned boy and a broken man. The storm, at long last, had passed over both their houses. He closed the folder and looked up at the woman who had knocked on his door at 9:40 on the worst and best night of his life. "Yeah," he said, "let's build it." Sometimes the thing that breaks us is also the door we walk through to be made whole. Simone Radcliffe had all the power in the world, and it could not lift the silence off her child. That took a broken man with a river stone in his pocket and a chant he'd made up out of love. And Elias Thorne had spent 3 years, believing his life was the sum of the one he couldn't save, only to find out that the frightened boy he'd carried through the flood had been keeping his voice safe the whole time, waiting to hand it back and heal them both. If this story reached something in you tonight, do me a kindness. Hit that like button and share it with someone who's still waiting in the dark for the count to finish. Subscribe for more true-hearted stories about the strangers who change everything. And tell me down in the comments, who is the person who once pulled you to the shore, and did you ever get to tell them what it meant?